Many years ago, games like Age of Empires and Seven Kingdoms showed us that there can be more to an RTS game than just the combat. There is also the economy, up to a point, and a certain sense of evolution, a sense of progression of time that was best displayed up until then in the Civilization series. Not in the RTS genre, but in the turn-based strategy 4X genre. And by coincidence, a lot of those games were made by a handful of people. People that one day decided to go on their own and create a new studio. They would call it Big Huge Games. A lofty name with a lofty goal, that of taking the RTS world by storm and fighting against the very mainstays of the genre itself. Things like Warcraft, Starcraft, Command and Conquer, Red Alert, Age of Empires, even Total Annihilation if you'll have it. This dream was put forward in the year 2000 when Big Huge Games was founded, and within just a couple of months, the development team that had on it people like Brian Reynolds, who you may know as the designer of Civilization 2 and Alpha Centauri being one of the best games ever made. Within a few months, they had a working prototype of their game. And they took it around to other companies and told them, hey, you know who we are, you know what we can do, here's what we're working on. And one of the companies that responded was Microsoft. Now keep in mind, this was the year 2000. This was back when Microsoft was still playing nice with PC games. It was before they turned completely Xbot on us. And regardless of what you may feel about Microsoft in its later ages, back then it really had commitment to helping developers produce PC games. And they showed a lot of support to the people at Big Huge Games, especially in the departments of playtesting and usability. Their help was invaluable on account of Big Huge Games not being that big or huge and only being made up out of 20-something people. The game they were making was called Rise of Nations, one in which you would begin with a very small village. It had to evolve and develop over the course of years, decades, ages, until eventually it acquired even destructive technology at the scale of a nuclear weapon to eradicate all its opposition. Now, to you it may seem like that would be the logical thing they would make, on account of this was a company founded by people that worked on Civilization, but Rise of Nations was just one of the ideas of an RTS that they had, and the one they chose to bring to fruition on account of they had experience with this kind of theme. But it wasn't the only one that they wanted to make. Something that is very evident on account of the sequel to Rise of Nations was a fantasy game. This was not what you would call a classical RTS. On account of, while they were developing it, Empire Earth was released, which was more of a classical RTS in the vein of Age of Empires. It also had the idea of progressing through many time periods from the old ages up until post-nuclear, cybernetic warfare, nanomachines, space age stuff. Rise of Nations wouldn't go that far. It would also try to be a bit more sensible and realistic in its approach to the subject matter, which is another way of saying that there won't be any sort of prophets making hurricanes or tornadoes or the occasional laser-equipped cyborg that's hunting people down in the post-apocalyptic Russia. I think that's one of the campaigns of Empire Earth, actually. And it wasn't gonna go too far into history either. It wasn't gonna be about you being a caveman, figuring out how to start fires and conk people over the head. It's gonna be from the medieval period to the modern age. A manageable portion of time. Again, this wasn't a very big team, so they could only do more than that. But what you got in each age was actually more than you would see in something like Age of Empires. While you wouldn't unlock new buildings with each age, you would unlock different units and different upgrades for your buildings, for your units, and more ways to use them depending on what exactly you researched. The DNA of Civilization and Alpha Centauri cannot really be missed in this game. You don't start out with a central building, or at least it's not meant to represent the building. You start out with a small town that you evolve over the course of the age into a big city. And although the scale is a bit RTSified, where a building can take up as much space as the town itself, it is something that manages to set it apart a bit, to make it feel a bit more like Seven Kingdoms than Age of Empires, or, if you will, more akin to Civilization. In terms of the actual mechanic, you cough up workers from your town, you put them to work making one of up to 5 farms that can be supported by a city, or you put them to work in a mine, in a lumber mill. In later ages you will find oil, or you just have them hang around and build things for you. But the important thing is that they're tied to the building that they're working for. People working in the mine will not really go back to town and deposit resources, they have a mine for that. Same goes for the people working to cut down a forest. And they won't cut it down in real time until there's nothing left. It'll take quite a bit of time to cut it down. It's more of a metaphor for a forest than an actual one, if you will. It's a representation of something bigger. And so when you begin the game, usually next to your town there's the library where you will have to research everything that you need to progress through the ages. And the research is, as I've said, very much akin to Alpha Centaurian Civilization. It's spread out into different categories: military, civics, commerce, and science. Each of them giving you bonuses in certain aspects. For example, you can't really have a good economy if you don't research commerce, because there's a cap, a limit on how many resources of one type you can actually gather before you need to research something new. Now, you may wonder why this would be there. It sounds like it's just a nuisance and annoyance. Well, it's there for a reason. The game can be played in many ways, one of them being limited evolution, which may in turn bring with itself limited technology. So if you just want to play something with small-scale warfare, you can limit that to the sheer fact that resources will not be gathered so quickly. I think, probably, hopefully. I think that was the idea for it. Otherwise it would be kind of an annoyance. It's just there to fill space. And as you build up your small settlement, you realize that maybe it's a good idea to actually build a new town somewhere close by, so that you would have access to more resources and, very importantly, to increase the boundaries of your kingdom, of your nation, if you will. Rise of Nations implemented an idea that's not really all that common in RTS games: attrition. The idea that while away from your borders, your units will degrade with time. To counteract this, you need to have them be accompanied by supply wagons, which will continuously give them the resources they need to perform as best they can. And if you're playing as the French, then your supply wagons can actually heal them. After all, this is a civilizations-like game, so there are many civilizations from which to choose, none of them existing between Germany and Russia on a map, because according to American developers, there's nothing in there. There's Germany, Russia, and Greece somewhere downstairs. Nothing in between exists. But of course, America existed in medieval times. I mean, of course it did. Goddamn racists. But back to the attrition idea. It was made to give players a sense of the complexities of warfare. Though to be honest, it's not really something absolutely pivotal in the combat system that you cannot do without. This is in comparison to Conquest Frontier Wars, which also had attrition, where your supplies would run out and your ships would be just dead in the water without them. Because it was made to feel a bit like Civilization, it also had a similar combat type, where you would have units that were weak versus something and strong versus something else. So it was always a good idea to have a balanced mix of units and keep them in formation as much as possible. You didn't have actual formations like you did in Age of Empires, but you could put them at least in a line and then move them around to face whichever way you wanted. So the bits that were weak against what the enemy was fielding towards you would be at the rear and protected, hopefully by something that can counteract what the enemy was sending towards you. Now, if the enemy was sending a nuke towards you, you had better hope that you knew where the nuke was landing and you could run away. Though regarding nukes, the game did set up an idea that was honestly good but not well implemented. It had an Armageddon clock. If too many nukes were being used in a game, it would end. Everybody would lose. Now, people could actually use about 10 nukes before that happened, so if there was a small-scale conflict between just two factions, the first one that launched a nuke won, because a nuke in this game You thought that the nuke in Command & Conquer Netheralert was something destructive. Here it would just destroy everything in a smallish radius, but you were kind of encouraged to build cities close together, titling it an account if you got bonuses from buildings, and you're basically building every building next to a city so it would augment it. But the idea is that after the first nuke fell, recovering from it, if that was your only city, oh boy, I hope it wasn't, would have been hard, so there was a real advantage to the first person that actually fired the first nuke. If this was an 8-way player battle, if you were one of the last to get the nuke, odds are if you fired it, the game was over and everybody would have lost. Though there was an upgrade that let you actually turn back the clock a bit. I'm gonna come back to this in a moment. Again, because this was essentially civilization in real time, you would find scattered around the map all sorts of resources. You would find ancient ruins that would give you gold, would give you food somehow, and you also find what you would call in civilization luxury resources. Wool, you'd find aluminium, you'd find horses, you'd find all sorts of things that gave you certain bonuses as long as you had the merchant build a shack there and hopefully still being able to keep it once the enemy rolled by you. You could build these outside of your territory, which is something you can do with pretty much any other building, apart from oil rigs which you can build out at sea with no problem. But unlike civilization, you could not trade with these resources. It was clearly made more as a war-focused game than even Seven Kingdoms was. And that I feel is kind of a letdown. Because yes, it is an RTS and you would expect an RTS to be more about combat. It sort of lessens what it could have been. There really isn't that much to the diplomacy aspect of the game or to its economy when it comes to dealing with other nations. You can set up caravans between your own cities and between your cities and that of allied nations, but it's not really something complex. And that's honestly something you could pretty much say about the entire game. If you've played Age of Empires and Empire Earth, part of the game ends up being a bit of a letdown. More so if you've played Alpha Centauri actually. This game does not have what you would call a single player campaign, it has scenario campaigns. It has basically the Risk game, where you have the world map or part of the world map and you control a territory at the beginning. You move your army to one place, you conquer it, by which I mean you initiate a real-time strategy combat. You then go back to the world map, which is in a turn-based combat mode, sort of like a version of Total War that still has an RTS component, not a real-time tactics component. You end your turn, you collect cards, you maybe upgrade some regions, and you repeat the process until you win. What is nice though is that it does have a world campaign, where you begin in the earliest possible timeline, and every few turns the technology level of everybody evolves. And that almost makes it feel like it's an actual story, but it just doesn't have any sort of heft to it, any tangible emotion. And this coming from some of the same people that made Alpha Centauri is incredibly disappointing. As an RTS, it works great, it's got some good ideas, some mechanics that are really interesting, but you don't feel the same magic in developing your nation. There's no story there. There's no sense of a grand campaign either, even though it is a campaign that can take place on the map of the entire world. It just doesn't have the feeling of scope, of epicness that it could have had. Which again is understandable because it's made by a very, very small team. But it could have done some things, like add a couple of touches like the Doomsday Clock, Garmageddon Clock actually being a permanent thing. Something that carries onwards into the global campaign if you're playing like the Conquest mode, the Risk type of game, and not something that's just limited to the RTS portion. Like that small thing, that little detail, that could have reshaped the way that entire campaign is played, because there's actual consequences for the way you win battles, for the way you fight your war. That could have made a story. The only permanence you have in those battles is the wonders that you can build on the TBS side and that will show up physically in the RTS portion and will have a global effect. But it's just not enough. Rise of Nations even got an extended edition, a sort of a remastered one if you will, a couple of years ago. It's the one that you're seeing now in the background. It's available right now on Steam for the price of around €5 on account of the Steam Autumn Sale. It's a game that I encourage you to try, but if you really loved Alpha Centauri and thought to yourself, man, could they have really taken the ideas of that, of civilization, and turned them into an RTS? Yes, they did, but they couldn't transplant the soul. The question is, could they have done it? In a way, I guess so. I mean, Conquest Frontier Wars sort of reminds me a bit more of that kind of game, because of its scope, because of its size, of the sense of exploration. Seven Kingdoms, up to a point, does as well. This sort of teeters on the line between being a classical RTS and something that tried to be a bit more than that. In the end, it just sort of got stuck in the middle. It's still a great game, really, but maybe it could have been even greater. Goodbye.